Today, for a Chapter 6 mini lecture, I wanted to sort of take the first section of the chapter and expand a bit on it. So, the sensory system principles, that's the first kind of section. The vocabulary for it is brief but very interesting to understand sensation, perception, and perception. So, sensation and perception are very different, but, well, not very different, but distinguished, essentially. And so, sensation is the process by which the nervous system detects physical events around or inside of us. And then, perception is the experience we have as we process and interpret information from sensory cells. So, the main difference and the biggest emphasis is on perception being the experience of the process, while sensation is the process itself. So then percept is the final interpretation of a stimulus, and stimulus we'll talk more about in a bit. So essentially, natural selection has evolved to craft ways to provide clues about what's going on around us, and this keeps us safe and aware. Obviously, the five senses and for example, hearing makes us aware of what other people are saying and things going on around us. Sight or vision keeps us also aware of what's going on around us to see where we're going. Smell and taste are very important as well, and then touch in addition to that. We rely on our senses, obviously, to keep us safe and make our way in the world. But last part of this mini section, the brain can distort sensory information because some bits of information are more important than others. And essentially, our brain is a big computer that can tell which parts are more important than others and then filter those out. So the next subsection is about sensation, beginning with a stimulus. I said we talk more about stimulus in a bit. So sensation begins with a stimulus, and the vocabulary. A stimulus is any physical event that affects a sensory receptor cell. And a sensory receptor cell is also called a receptor, and that is basically specialized sensory cells that detect stimuli. A sensory receptor organ is a clump of receptor cells, all detecting a particular kind of stimulus. Audition is the process of hearing. Olfaction is the process of smelling odors. Sensory modalities are the different types of senses, for example, vision, hearing, taste, touch, and smell. An adequate stimulus is the type of stimulus for which a given sensory receptor organ is particularly adapted. And then label lines is the concept that specific nerves are dedicated to relaying specific types of sensory information to the brain, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. So stimuli are detected by clusters of sensory receptor cells, also known as sensory receptor organs. However, some things like taste and smell rely on receptor cells distributed throughout the body. Receptor organs are meant to detect a certain stimulus or physical event. And then the vestibular system, it's in addition to the traditional five senses, and it's actually very crucial. The vestibular system gives a sense of balance and proprioception, and proprioception is information from sensory cells throughout the muscle and skin reporting on the position and movement of the body. So that's very important as well. So going back to labeled lines for a second, there's a diagram in the book, a visual in the book about a woman holding a coffee cup, and the labeled lines going from her hand, the pain line, touch line, stretch line, and vibration line, and then going up to the brain. So essentially labeled lines are specific nerves that bring information to the brain. So that's why when you stimulate the receptor cells in your eye with gentle touch from your finger, you see that the black spot really isn't there because your brain has received information coming across the vision line that normally carries information about light, and it interprets it in the modality of vision. So label lines do not just convey information about the modality, of course. In the touch system, separate axons send information about light touch, while others report pain or vibrations or stretch. So basically, there's a different labeled line for every specific thing. The next subsection is about the all detection systems having thresholds. So the vocabulary for this is very short, but a sensory code is the relationship between stimuli and the action potentials they produce in sensory cells. And then a threshold is the weakest possible stimulus that still affects a sensory cell's firing. So a stimulus that is hardly strong enough to affect the receptor is a threshold stimulus. A Really weak stimuli are below threshold, so they have no effect on the receptor, and strong stimuli are above threshold, so they affect the receptor signal to the brain. And then one of the next sections, psychophysics systematically analyzes perception. So the vocabulary for this, you have absolute threshold, which is the lowest intensity of a stimulus that can be detected half the time. The just noticeable difference, or JND, is also called the difference threshold, and it's the smallest change in magnitude of a stimulus that can be detected. And then Weber's fraction is the smallest change in the magnitude of a stimulus that can be detected and is expressed as a proportion of the original stimulus. So psychophysics measures the frequency at which a person can detect a stimulus of a given strength, and it also measures the JND. And then just a relationship. So the mathematical relation between the JND and a stimulus is Weber's fraction. And then we have detection involves finding a signal in the background of noise. So then noise is the firing of a sensory cell without a stimulus or to an irrelevant stimulus. The signal detection theory is a way to measure how well a real stimulus or a signal is detected in the midst of a relevant stimuli or noise. So I said note the blue figure in the top right corner, and this is just about the event and participant's response. So essentially, if the signal, if there is a signal and we recognize it, if the participant recognizes it, there's a hit, which means there was a signal and it was detected. If there was no noise but the participant responded, it's technically like a false alarm. I say that in quotation marks, which is where they thought it was a signal but there wasn't. If there was a signal and the participant missed it, that was a miss, and there was a signal that wasn't detected. And then if there was no signal and the participant did not respond at all, it's a correct rejection. So the participant decided there was no signal and they were right. Stimulus can be sensitive, while they can also be dull, which is important to note. And then we have a stimulus that doesn't change is unimportant, so sensory systems ignore it. And essentially, this just is about, sensory adaptation. So sensory adaptation is the progressive loss of responsiveness in sensory cells exposed to a constant stimulus. So a sensory system will stop firing touch receptors after a while. And for this example in the book, they use a leg up against a chair kind of example. So if you're sitting at dinner and you have your leg up against a dinner table or a chair, touch receptors in your leg will automatically fire, telling you about that contact. But if you leave your leg there, the touch receptors will stop firing because it's an adaptation that they're being adapted to, and they don't need to keep reminding you about it. And then sensory adaptation is when after a while cell firing slows down because the receptors are used to it. So this just is basically a description of the leg against chair example I mentioned before. And that's about it for this section of the chapter, just the first section. And yeah,